Even if it's not something you've read, you may still be familiar with the name. What some people may not know is that it's just one part of a three-part work written by Dante Alighieri, known as Divina Commedia, the Divine Comedy, a narrative poem that follows the concept of the journey one must take after death, as thought of by many during the Middle Ages. We as the audience travel alongside Dante through hell, purgatory, and heaven, which are the three segments of this narrative: Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. It's a story that certainly gives you an interesting insight into the social conditions and expectations during the Middle Ages. And if you also happen to be a fan of Greek and Roman mythology, Dante does not shy away from showing its influence on his own work. There are references upon references upon references. But as we are talking about a piece of work that was written in the 14th century, some of the language used means it's not the easiest or most fun read. However, at its core...
Dante's Hell. More than 1,000 years ago. So, that's based upon the Catholic Church. But did you notice in that little introductory part of that video, he mentions that hell goes back before the Catholic Church and before the Roman Empire. It mentions about Greek, Egyptian and Mesopotamia, Babylonia. They all had hells. So Dante's hell comes from those, while presenting the kind of Christian view. The Christian view as displayed by the Catholic Church with hell, purgatory, of course, and paradisio, heaven. In this Bible dictionary, produced by Jehovah's Witnesses, this says here, it says, the word hell thus originally conveyed no thought of heat or torment, but simply of a covered over of a concealed place. In the Old English dialect, the expression helling potatoes meant not to roast them, but simply to place the potatoes in the ground or a cellar. And of course, farmers today keep their potatoes in the dark because it preserves them. So the meaning given today of the word hell is portrayed as is mentioned in Dante's Divine Comedy and Milton's Paradise Lost. The idea of suffering a death is found amongst pagan religious teachings of ancient peoples of Babylon, Egypt, Assyria, Greece. It says, neither the underworld is a place full of horrors presided over by gods and demons of great strength and fierceness. There are pits of fire, this is in Egypt, for the damned. So then the encyclopedia talks about Americana, talks about hellfire. There's much confusion and misunderstanding has been caused through the early translations of the Bible, persistently rendering the Hebrew word Sheol and the Greek word Hades to be the word hell. Now, in the Old English language, that was like putting the body in the ground or under the ground, which is like a grave. But sadly, by the word hell meaning a place of torment, it's created a lot of confusion. A lot of Bible versions now don't mention hell. They mention death as the place to go to. So there's some element of honesty there. Now, some people who are Christians, they make a number of claims. I'll be looking into some by some pastors in another shorter video, but in this one, most Christians refer to Luke 16, where Jesus actually gives an illustration of a poor man called Lazarus and a rich man called a rich man. And it explains that the rich man never even bothered about the poor man, and then the rich man eventually died, and the poor man, Lazarus, ended up in kind of heaven in Abraham's bosom. That's a favoured position. And the rich man was suffering, torments. So what does Jesus mean? Well, he was speaking to Pharisees, Jewish religious leaders, who were there trying to trick him. And he, as you may know already, had mentioned quite a number of times, he had a number of run-ins with these religious people, and they hated him, and he didn't particularly like them because of the way they behaved. So that's the theme. And then he mentions this expression of the rich man. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses have a research tool that works on each verse of the Bible. If you download their JW app and you go onto the online Bible, each verse has a research guide that has, it can have 100 pages of research, documents, investigations. And in this particular one, it says the Catholic Jerusalem Bible in the footnote explains this parable in story form without reference to any historical personage. Now, so the Catholic Church itself, there is making it clear that this is a parable. This isn't a real expression. So what's Jesus trying to teach? Because that's what parables were used for. It says here, quoting, "Now in course of time the beggar died and was carried off by the angels to the bosom position of Abraham. Also the rich man died and was buried, and in Hades," that would normally be the grave, "he lifted up his eyes, he existing in torments, and he saw Abraham afar off, and Lazarus in the bosom position with him. So he called and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Send Lazarus to dip the tip of my finger in water and cool my tongue, because I'm in anguish in this blazing fire." That's Luke 16:19 to 24. Now, the rich man hadn't actually committed any kind of crime against the poor man other than just ignore him. So he couldn't be classified as an evil person deserving to go to this hell that they talk about. And Lazarus, there's no indication that he had done anything to deserve being in heaven either. He had just been a poor man and a beggar. So it says here, if the rich man was in a literal fire, surely Lazarus could not benefit him with just a drop of water. So who then is pictured by the rich man and who is by Lazarus? Because Jesus gave parallels as teaching lessons, didn't he? So the rich man pictured the self-important religious leaders, who he was actually talking to at the time, who failed to feed the people spiritually, because that was their responsibility. The scribes and the Pharisees, the rabbis in the synagogues, their job was to teach their flocks, as leaders in the churches are meant to do today. It says Lazarus pictured the common people, their parishioners, the common people who were not fed spiritually. This common people who accepted Jesus became Christians, didn't they? And their deaths represented a change in their condition. So what was the change in the condition of those who followed Jesus? Well, they had a hope. They reconciled their relationship with God, they made peace with him, and they became Christians, followers of Christ. So it says here, Jesus fed the neglected Lazarus-like people spiritually. Thus they came to be in favour with the greater Abraham, God himself, the Father. At the same time, the self-important Jewish religious leaders died with respect to having God's favour, and they came to be tormented. Now, why were they tormented? By the teachings of Christ and his followers. And they were, because they were the ones who got together and got Jesus killed, because he tormented them. He's ruining their religious business. And this is confirmed by the first Christian martyr called Stephen. It says here, Stephen publicly exposed them for their hypocrisy. And what happened? It says they felt cut to their hearts and began to gnash their teeth, and they put their hands over their ears and all accord took up stones and stoned that poor Christian martyr to death. So the message and their way of life tormented the hypocrites, the religious hypocrites. So that tells you something. So Jesus was making a point there that the religious leaders were hypocrites because they knew what they should be doing, but they chose a different course of life, and they denied that the important thing of teaching the ordinary common folk, which was their responsibility within the Mosaic law, but they didn't do it. Fortunately, Jesus did. So that sums that up. So hell, according to this, Jesus didn't teach hell, you see. And he said that when people died, they went into the grave and they waited for a resurrection in the future. So I'm going to do another video on this in relation to a response to a Christian pastor. There's also a nice little point about this religion. They came about because a group of students in the 1870s got together, and the one thing they agreed about was that in their little churches, the Adventists and the evangelical churches in America, where they were, they taught hell, and they couldn't accept that a loving God would have hell. They discovered, after some Bible study, there is no such place. It comes from pagan mythology. It was repeated by Dante's Inferno, for example, and was incorporated in the Catholic Church. And the Protestants, you'd have thought, would have looked at their scriptures in their Bible and would have abandoned that teaching. But sadly, a whole host of teachings that the Catholic Church teaches that really aren't in the words, and they're certainly not what Jesus taught, remain in the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches, and hence this insistence on believing in hell. So thank you very much. So I have no fear of hell. The worst thing that can happen to anyone is that they die, which means being asleep. Nice to have spoken to you. There will be a video, another one on this subject, and there will be one about the immortal soul, what happens to your soul when you die. So that's another important one to know the truth about. And the truth about it, according to the Bible, is a complete relief. You can kind of rest in peace and be at peace. So thank you very much.